Now, what is your favorite Soviet song? I'd like to introduce you with some.
Okay, my favorite Soviet song would be Poluskopole, because it was also my ringtone. But find a good version. Find the Red Army version, not one of these more modern versions.
Okay. Yeah, I know that one. All right, how's this?
But also Spotify told me, actually you can include this if you want. Spotify told me that for the year 2024, or YouTube Music, one of these things, the song I played most times were The Boatmen of Volga, which is also a Soviet song. I like the song, and I was listening to it while preparing for the course. So I like when I prepare for the course, I immerse myself in communist music, communist films. I try to get into it. If I could, I would travel actually to Moscow or to St. Petersburg if it was safe. I like to get into something when I studied.
Yeah, I think you're the only other objectivist I know that also appreciates communist music, or some of it. I mean, most of it's pretty bad, but there are, I'd say, about 10 to 20% of communist music is actually very idealistic. That's what I like about it. Yeah. I tell
you one thing. I don't know if we're recording, but again, if we are not,
we are recording. We can take this out if you want, or we can keep it.
Yeah. No, let's not take it out, because I think people need to understand this. So I remember a veteran Greek communist telling to some people, and I overheard it, that good communist composers, like in Greece, there's a guy called Miki Theodorakis. So he said, good artists have brought more people in the cause. Like, it takes one artist to bring as many people as 1,000 agitators. So this shows why communism was so appealing, because it had this idealistic, this heroic vibe. And when it lost this heroic vibe, it was not that appealing anymore.
I see.
That's why I'm not too worried about today's leftist becoming such a mass movement, because it's totally uninspiring. There's nothing there to inspire someone who is young and idealistic.
I completely agree. And if you think about the way ideologies spread, whether they're good or bad, they do spread through art. That's why I think that the way to bring objectivism into, let's say, the cultural conversation, at least, is through art. We need to be screening We the Living and The Fountainhead. We need to be showing these films in cinemas. I think that's far more effective than just
in principle, I agree with you. Specifically, although I've watched The Fountainhead many times. I mean, I've even watched the crappy Atlas Shrugged films, because when you're a nerd early on, you want to consume everything. Like these films, I'm talking about the two you mentioned, they're good, but they're not, particularly The Fountainhead, not as good as the book. So I would always start with the book, because I think if you watch the movie, but you haven't read the book, you are missing so much.
Of course, yeah, I agree with that. But just time constraints, and also you can't really make a social occasion of book reading.
Yeah, I don't know.
I'll just sit quietly.
You probably can't. But I'm with you. I'm totally with you. In the first two Ocon conferences I ever attended, one of my favorite memories was the film nights. In the first one, we watched With the Living in 2022 in Washington. In the second one, 2023 in Miami, we watched The Fountainhead. And although usually at Ocons I go to bed at like 9:30, I stayed till late and I watched these two films. There's always something nice, particularly if you watch them in the big screen.
Definitely. And it also has that emotional effect which stays with you long after you've forgotten the logical structure of concept formation or measurement omission. That all comes later. You need to have some inspiration to kind of get what the philosophy is all about. And it's true for objectivism. And in the case of objectivism, it's actually true, right?
Let's concretize this, right?
Yeah.
Remember the last brilliant lines in The Fountainhead where the heroine, not to give spoils, goes up toward the skyscraper and the hero is up. I mean, when you read, I don't remember what was exactly my emotional reaction when I read it. I always remember, and I will always remember, what was my emotional reaction when I saw it in the film with Gary Cooper. So sometimes you need the visual to concretize something that otherwise is not cannot be concretized. But sometimes it's the opposite, right? You have something in your mind as a particular thing, and then you watch it on the screen, and it's completely different. I mean, again, the crappy Atlas films are an example for that. So, yeah. Anyway.
Yeah. Well, We the Living is really amazing. The film, as well as the book, of course.
Novel. I have somewhere here. Again, I got them from Ocon. These little cinema posters from the We the Living. It was.
Was that from Duncan Scott? You got those from Duncan Scott?
I don't remember who I got it for, but it was during Ocon, during the Ocon 23.
Oh, in Greece, right?
No, in Miami. I think that's where they portrayed that's where they've shown the film. Wait, no.
Okay.
Anyway, I don't remember where it's from. One of it's one from one of the Ocons.
In Washington.
Yes. Sorry. 22 in Washington. 23 was the Fountain. Yeah, you have a better memory than I do with these things.
Well, I just recently learned it because I just spoke to Duncan Scott recently. So I've invited him onto the podcast to talk about We the Living. And I'm, really hoping to help him bring it to Australia and also just, around the world, because We the Living is a fantastic film. It's quite long, it's 3 hours. And they had to cut out the very last scene on Ayn Rand's request. Are you aware of that?
So I tell you, to avoid spoilers to people who haven't watched it.
Yeah.
The version I've watched, and I've watched this version both in Ocon, which is, let's say, the latest version, the latest cut, and I've watched it, I don't know, when I was a newbie, it was probably some pirated YouTube version, whatever. The ending is slightly different. Whenever I see in a movie, different from the book, whenever I see in a movie something which is different from a book, I'm completely put off, generally. But that particular ending, I found it so beautiful, so emotional, that I didn't mind. So I don't know which ending was cut, and I haven't seen the alternative ending. I've seen both times and watched in one ending, which is, let's say it's not as directly sad as the book, and the book has to be a sad ending because of the premises of the book. But I liked it. I found it so touching, so moving. It was very beautiful.
It certainly was. I was just surprised because I was thinking, okay, and then what? Because of course I know what happens in the novel.
At the end of the day, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
It leaves you with so much stuff in your soul. You feel so filled that it's not all what happened. Yes, it's just you leave the room and you are content in this enormity of emotions that you got.
Yeah, it's. I remember when I was 15. I'm Russian, so when I was 15, I went to visit St. Petersburg, and I spent 4 or 5 days basically wandering the city on my own. I was there with my grandmother, but she kind of just did her own thing, and I did my own thing, and I was functionally kind of alone. And it was wonderful as a 15-year-old who speaks Russian, going around St. Petersburg. Back then it was freer. This was, I think, 2016 or so, maybe 2017. And it went to the Hermitage Museum, Museum. Just I didn't know anything about Ayn Rand then. I had never heard of objectivism. But here's the cool thing. Much later, so about 2 years ago, when I read We the Living, I read a description of St. Petersburg halfway through the novel. So for those who haven't read it, it's set in St. Petersburg. Most of the novel is in St. Petersburg, which is also known as Leningrad or Petrograd, depending
Petrograd, Leningrad, St. Petersburg.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it went through several changes. So now there's a description of the city halfway through the novel, and it's a very interesting description. There's a bridge that's described, and on each corner of the bridge, there is a statue of a man and a horse. Have you ever been, Nikos?
No.
No? Okay. So, yeah.
I think I've been to every former communist country in Europe, including Albania, except Soviet Union. Or any former Soviet republic except from Georgia. But Georgia, because they want nothing to do with anything with Soviet Union, you can't see anything in terms of statutes from the time or anything.
Yeah. And obviously I can't go back either. You shouldn't go for obvious reasons, but I can't go at all because I'd be conscripted if I go to Russia.
All right. Yeah.
There's a genuine risk of that, at least. And I've written things against Russia, and people have gone to prison for much less. So in any case, what I was going to say is, when Ayn Rand described this bridge, in each corner of the bridge, there is a statue of a man and a horse, and they're in a different position in each corner. So the idea is, as you go around to the corners, you see, at first it's the horse about to trample the man. And then in the last one, he's already leading the horse. So the idea is man conquering nature and mastering reality.
That's very cool. And actually, that's not miles away from, actually, not miles away. It's exactly what was supposed to be the early Bolshevik heroic spirit, or at least the best people who were attracted to the Bolsheviks had exactly this Promethean spirit. Of course, it was very quickly denounced, interestingly, including by Lenin himself. Later, with Stalin, it was completely suppressed. But in early Soviet Union, there were even some of what today we would call transhumanists. There were some Bolsheviks who were thinking there was this guy who was doing these weird experiments with blood transfusions. So the idea was, can we actually even conquer death? And my favorite line ever uttered by any communist was a line by Maxim Gorky, the communist firebrand. He said something like, again in the early years of the regime, something like, when the Soviet Union, he didn't call it even that. He said, when the Soviet humankind wins the class war, then we will engage in a war against our final enemy, nature.
Nature, yes. I remember this from a Marx and Communism course.
Yeah. This I will never not be fascinated by this line. That this idea that humanity can not only change nature, but can even change what we consider as being the human limits. Again, of course, if you're intellectually honest, soon you realize that this noble vision is not compatible with communism. But it was a nice vision. It was an inspiring vision. And again, no surprise, so many idealistic people with good intentions were attracted to that in the early stages before they realized what this really was and where it was going.
And it's actually the opposite of today's environmentalism, which we will discuss. It's very interesting how Marxism had very little in common in certain ways with today's environmentalism, and yet the environmentalism came out of the Marxism. So I'd like to ask you about that. But wait, let me just finish my story. Wait, I never finished the story. So I saw this bridge and I admired it immensely. And I really loved all the statues. And I didn't even grasp at the time that the 4 statues had a special pattern to them. I didn't really notice it at the time. But then I read it in We the Living, and I was like, oh my God, I remember being really transfixed by this bridge when I was there, and this statue of the horse about to trample the man. And then I went through and looked at my old photos, and indeed there it was. So I thought, wow, Ayn Rand was here, like 100 years before I was. and pretty much pretty much exactly 100 years, with give or take a couple of years before I was, and also like love this bridge. So it was very
nice. Yeah, I just realized I've never been to a place where something significant in, I don't know, objectivism history has happened. I haven't been to New York. I haven't been to Ayn Rand's where she was living on the western coast. I haven't even been to the old offices of ARI. So you walking in that bridge, you've been closer to, let's say, history than I have.
It's called the Anchikov Bridge, if you want to look it up.
Well, it's going to Russia whenever there's a regime change. I'm going there. I'm definitely going there. I even want to go to the mausoleum of Lenin. So I'll have to go fast before they remove it. Though I think there is something to keeping some of these historical monuments. I really like in Berlin, where in East Berlin you still have some of the names of the streets because it's part of the history of the city. So I mean, then the question is, okay, where do you stop? If they had like a 30-meter statue of Hitler, do you keep it there? So, but I like when there are some remnants that indicate that history unfolded in this or that other place.
Well, okay. We started in a way I hadn't intended, but we'll roll with it. So I believe I wanted to introduce you with some music. All right, we'll do a proper introduction now, Nikos.
But don't cut this opening. This opening was
we're keeping this. We're keeping this. Yes, it'll ruin my appeal on YouTube, but we'll keep it. Hold on. My guest today is Nikos Sotirakopoulos. Dr. Sotirakopoulos received his PhD in political sociology from the University of Kent in the UK and taught in UK universities for 10 years. He's currently teaching a course on Marx and Communism at AIU, in which I am enrolled. He has written 2 books, The Rise of Lifestyle Activism, From New Left to Occupy, and Identity, Politics and Tribalism, The New Culture Wars. I had the pleasure of meeting Nikos last December in Brisbane at the very first Australian Ayn Rand Conference and enjoyed his speech titled, "What Have the Capitalists Ever Done for Us?" The answer, in my view, is they created the wealth on which our lives depend. Nikos, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. And I think there was another talk. Yes, there was another talk, actually, recollections of an old Marxist or something like that. I mean, I'm not old, but so that's also what we're gonna focus on today.
Okay, so let's start with this. So, unlike many objectivists, I can rarely bring myself to talk about or even to think too much about politics. The reason is that whenever I do, I am so profoundly disappointed, not to say disgusted, with what I see in politics. And all the injustices that, when you study a bit of philosophy, especially if it's a correct philosophy, you just integrate this information successfully and always come to some conclusion about just how evil things can get. So I really respect people like you and also Yaron Brook, who specialize in politics and who can tolerate contemplating evil on this scale, day in and day out. And you actually seem to be quite happy doing it. So you have my gratitude.
Oh, thank you. It's my life's passion. It's my life's passion. Not only communism, recently also the far right and the darkest parts of far right, studying fascism, studying Nazism, National Socialism. And you know what's the thing? What I find fascinating in all these maxims. So think about it this way, right? These are the movements that have lit the most powerful fire in the hearts of so many people. And there's a curiosity there. How did that happen? And also there's the issue, how do we make sure that this doesn't happen again? But I mean, you have to be curious how so many people were ready to die for these movements, but they were also eager to kill for these movements, or the other way around. They were ready to kill for these movements, but they were also ready to die for these movements. There were so many communists executed around World War II, and their last words were "Vive Stalin." There were even people executed by the Soviets themselves, in the purges, whose last words were "Long live Stalin." So I'm fascinated to see how did these movements create this enthusiasm, this loyalty. And of course, there's not that much to learn from these movements, because you could say, okay, they appealed to something, irrationality, or they appealed to a bad morality, a bad philosophy. Agreed. But also, there are things that we can learn from these movements. How do they appeal to so many idealistic people? How do they appeal to so many of the best minds, scientists, artists? So it's a topic that, yes, I'm actually very much fascinated about. And by the way, something similar is the case with fascism. Most people think that only thugs and the worst type of people fell for fascism. Historically, that's definitely not the case. So it is worth understanding a little better these movements.
Yes, and that's what I hope to ask you all about today. We're going to cover everything you mentioned. I've got notes. We'll get to this, including the far right. So we'll include everything. Let's start with your intellectual journey up to the present. All I know about this is that you read Das Kapital 3 times.
That's because it's my Twitter bio.
Yes, but I mean, like, what, were you bored or something?
Well, the thing is, the only reason the main reason I abandoned Marxism is because I took Marxism seriously. And I realized that there are some contradictions there. But anyway, to give the half-a-minute answer, my intellectual journey, I became politicized in the late 90s. The main thing that politicized me was the NATO bombings against Serbia, which, by the way, still I'm not convinced that it was a good idea. But anyway, that's for another discussion. So 97% of Greek people back then were in favor of the Serbians. This created a huge anti-Americanism for me. Anti-Americanism went hand in hand with anti-capitalism. Then for many years, I was in the darkest of dark paths, anti-Semitism, nihilism, you name it. Till at some point around 2011, 2012, I decided, okay, since you're a Marxist, how about you take this a bit seriously, study this a bit deeper. And by studying this a bit deeper, and also maybe through some changes in my character, in my personality, in the things I would do in my life, I realized that this is not the path for me. And this is like, I had some good visions, some good ideals, like I wanted humanity to prosper, to go to space, like where are our flying cars? And then I realized that Marxism is not the vehicle for that. The left is not the vehicle for that. So that's the story in a nutshell.
Yeah, well, it's very good that, I mean, I think it shows a very active exercise of free will and thinking about things to go from, genuinely agreeing with and believing all these really false and evil ideologies through to developing yourself intellectually to the point where you come to, eventually embrace objectivism once you're aware of the philosophy. So yeah. That's great.
Still student of objectivism. I wouldn't call myself an objectivist because, my understanding of the philosophy is still developing. And
yes, me too.
Yeah, I always do make this proviso. So I don't consider myself also an expert in philosophy in general. So I'm just managing expectations on what I can contribute to a discussion.
Yeah. No, we're going to talk about your areas of specialty, but we're not going to talk about really objectivism. But okay, so that's great. And then you eventually went on to read Austrian economists, and then
Austrian economists. Yeah. By the way, it all started by a coincidence. So I was I was against environmentalism even when I was a Marxist. So back in the day, there was not much political content in YouTube, but there was political/philosophical content in something that was called iTunes Library, which probably no one has visited this thing for the last 15 years. I don't even know if it exists. So I remember I put something like criticism of environmentalism. And it comes with a lecture by, of all people, Walter Block, the anarcho-capitalist, which back then I didn't know anarcho-capital, didn't know any of these things. So it was a guy who was attacking environmentalism from a free market point of view. So I thought, okay, that's interesting. And through this, I came along the Austrian School of Economics. And through that, I found some answers that earlier were intellectually torturing me. For example, mostly answers about the labor theory of value. So I had simple questions like, is LeBron James being exploited by, back then he was in the Miami Heat, is he being exploited by his team? Or is a Facebook engineer being exploited? Like these simple questions. Or what is the relationship between value and price? And suddenly with the Austrian school, I find these answers, and it was a shock to the system. But also it was a very beautiful period. It was a period of, it's like you open a window and there's light that comes in the room. It was a difficult period personally in terms of, you lose friends, people then tell you, you're a horrible person and so on and so forth. But intellectual clarity is always very, very nice, very beautiful. Within some months, then I discovered Ayn Rand, not as a free market thinker or anything like that. I first discovered her as a critic of the New Left, because back then I was working my first book on the New Left. And I read The Return of the Primitive, and I realized, what am I doing? This person has said everything. But then I'm like, okay, be careful, not get too carried away. Still I thought I was half a Marxist. Still reading half of Atlas Shrugged, I still consider myself, maybe there's some other left out there which is truly progressive, which is truly for human flourishing. But by the end of Atlas Shrugged, it was like, yeah, you have to choose. It's either or.
Either or, yeah, exactly. The law of the excluded middle. Yeah. Yeah, so you did mention that you disagreed with or you rather couldn't understand the labor theory of value, didn't make any sense. And indeed, from what, I mean, I don't understand it as well as you do, of course, but I did learn what you taught us about it. The part of the lecture I listened to. And indeed, it doesn't seem to make sense. I had a conversation with ChatGPT about it. I was thinking, wait, so if you spend, so just quickly, the labor theory of value basically is the value of something.
The value of this glass
yes.
It's how much time an average worker would put into creating this glass. And the labor theory of value says we can exchange this pen and this mug because both of them have something in similar. What do they have in similar? Like if you there's some essence. There's some entity, there's something which is common between both of them. And this is plastic. Yeah, there's something. And Marx says, I can't see anything that they have in common, except they both involve some human labor. And that's why they can exchange with each other, which it's not a completely crazy theory, right? So if that's the only theory you've ever heard in your life, like, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I don't mean to dismiss anyone who takes it seriously, because I'm sure you can come at it from a different angle. But I always thought I've been mistaken about many things, but I don't think I've been mistaken about the labor theory of value, because it seemed absolutely ridiculous. Because my first question when I heard that was, what if I spend 10 hours digging a hole and then 10 hours filling it up again? Does that hole now have value? Like, I've changed nothing about reality. I've turned up some dirt. Nothing of value has been created, and yet the Marxists would say there's 20 hours of labor in that.
And that's fascinating. First, it's fascinating that you had the intellectual independence to get it to that point. I also had this question, but because I was not so intellectually independent, I took without any objections the Marxist answer to that, because the Marxists do have an answer.
Oh, okay. I didn't know.
And they say they call it the mud pie theory, right? If you make a pie, let's say a cake, and you put it in the oven, created by mud, by sand, that no one wants to eat, he says this hasn't got value. The obvious next step is, okay, then value comes by the fact that someone wants this something.
Yes.
But, you know, I didn't take that step. That's why when I saw the subjective theory of value, it was like, liberation, like, obviously, yes. Like, even Marxists see that there's a problem there, but they don't have the intellectual guts to take it a step further and say, yes, of course. This shows that, actually, to get back to this example, what these two have in common is that someone else wants them. The guy who exchanges this for that, it's the eternal Yaron Brook argument, with his phone. I wanted this phone more than Apple wanted this phone. Apple wanted my money more than I wanted my money. Therefore, we exchanged. So, yeah, that's the labor.
When you exchange for the phone, you don't care how many labor hours went into making the phone. You only care what good that phone can do for you.
Exactly. Exactly.
So that's right. So, okay. All right. Moving on. Let's get into the serious philosophy of Marxism. So could you explain what Hegel's idealism consisted in, and then how Marx took that and transformed it into dialectical materialism?
Yeah, I can't do that well. I think there are probably no more than 10 people in the world who can understand Hegel and explain it in simple language, and I'm definitely not one of them. So I'll just put it simple. So what does Marx take from Hegel? Again, this is on a super superficial level, because that's as deep as I can get with Hegel. So Hegel says that history is going somewhere, is heading towards somewhere. Life is not futile and how to put it? It's not just random.
Meaningless.
It's not meaningless. It's not random. History is going somewhere, and it's going somewhere which it is a good point, right? So we're not heading towards disaster. We are getting towards the light, to put it this way. Now, who is we? We as humanity. So there are two things that are happening. We are going somewhere. That somewhere is a beautiful place. And to get to there, we need to overcome our, individuality and become one, so to speak.
Sounds a lot like religion, right?
The more you hear about it, the more it sounds like religion.
We're all going to heaven if we just renounce this earth. And
something like that. But here's the catch. How we get there is through conflict / struggle / motion. One thing brings the other, two things clash, and then something else comes in. So let's have three things then that we hold. Conflict, progress forward, becoming one. Conflict, going forward, history going forward, becoming one. How does Marx translate this? Yes, history is moving towards a particular direction. This happens to struggle. What type of struggle? Of one class versus another class. And
that's already Marx, right? Hegel never said that about classes, right?
Hegel didn't talk about classes. And
he
what
thought
is
it
that?
was spirits, right? He thought there was some spirit that was. So you said this conflict. The conflict is between the thesis and the antithesis, and then
the conflict in Hegel, which you probably know better than I do.
I don't.
The way I understand it, though, it's more like there's this spirit that is in conflict with itself, trying to find itself. Like, I don't know how this. Anyway, I don't want to comment on something that I don't understand, although I have serious doubts if it can be understood. But anyway, so yeah, for Hegel, so for Hegel is what we call idealism, i.e., there's this spirit that is in conflict with itself. Marx says, look, we're scientists here. Like, okay, Hegel is a great philosopher, whatever. We are scientists here. We're men of the Enlightenment. So let's try to figure out what is the scientific element in that. So Hegel says this conflict is God trying to find itself. Marx, and actually before Marx, this like young nerds, philosophy nerds that were calling themselves young Hegelians, including Feuerbach. He says, look, forget this religious crap. There is a conflict here, but it is not God trying to find himself. It is man trying to find himself. Man tries to find himself. So there is a conflict of man with his wrong ideas, with his superstitions and all that stuff. And we are getting towards somewhere, right? And how do we get there is the key there is labor, actually, work, because this is what makes us human. So in order to get to this promised land, so to speak, this will be where we're going to be truly human, who we truly are. And who we truly are is people who work in brotherhood. This was, by the way, we haven't even started with Marx yet. This is Feuerbach. So if you understand this, you see that Marx hasn't brought that much novelty in the table. So Marx takes Feuerbach and says, yes, actually, there is a path towards a promised, that sounds, for Marx, this would sound too religious. There is a path towards becoming who we truly are as human beings. Indeed, who we are as true, at the end of the road, you see a human being which is not alienated, which means he is who human beings are supposed to be. What human beings are supposed to be is people who work together and they work freely for each other. Freely means not in order to bring food on the table, but just because you like it. And what stops us from here to there is that work, or how we produce, is controlled by these guys. Now the capitalists, back in the day, it was the slave owners or the feudal serfs. So this is the relation. So Hegel gives a formula, and through Feuerbach, to put it simply, Marx translates this formula to something where the key struggle is the struggle of a class versus class, with the key question being how we produce. What we produce and how we produce it. And at the end of the road, there is a society, there is a future in which we produce as human beings are supposed to produce. This is the way I understand it, Marxism and Marx's theory of, let's say, of materialism in a nutshell.
Yeah, interesting. So I've been thinking about this is a little tangential, but I don't know, maybe you have something to say about this. I've thought about the way the word freedom is used in different philosophies to mean completely different things. For example, I was talking to a graduate student from the University of Sydney recently about Kant, and he knew a good deal about Kant. He said that Kant uses the word freedom to mean the freedom to bind yourself to duty. So in a way, it's kind of the opposite of freedom. It's like, it's the freedom that you have metaphysically, your free will, except that its purpose is not to achieve happiness or to make rational decisions, but to follow duty.
Everyone talks about freedom indeed. You're right.
Yeah. Everyone wants freedom. You know, I think I heard Michael Malice joke about this, like there's never been more freedom.
Literally everyone. So a couple of years ago, I was reading Dugin.
Yes.
So Dugin is a... Sorry?
Yeah. I wrote an article about Alexander Dugin. Yeah.
Yes. So Alexander Dugin is a guy who has managed something remarkable. He has taken every bad ideology and philosophy, and he took the worst things of all of them. So for Dugin, postmodernism is good. There's something good in fascism. There's something good in communism. It's only liberalism and enlightenment that there's nothing good there. But even Dugin, whose vision is a fusion of Oriental mysticism, postmodernism, fascism, communism, and nationalism, even this guy talks about freedom. I wouldn't be surprised if we get access to the North Korean... actually, we do have access to some North Korean propaganda. They even talk about the
freest country in the world.
Yeah. They talk about freedom. Yes, yeah. They're free from American imperialism, for example. So indeed, yes, you are right. Everyone thinks that, but of course, then we need to question: does this definition of freedom make sense? Because you're as good as your definitions. And for what it's worth, also Marx never truly defines his terms. which relates also to his philosophy, to what we would call, let's say, dialectics. So for Marx, there's not so much entities, they're processes. Everything is a process, everything is in motion, everything is becoming, everything is everything is developing.
So you can see how this goes back to Heraclitus in ancient Greece, right? Mm-hmm. Nothing is, everything is becoming, there are no entities, there are only processes, and contradictions are inherent in reality because the moment you identify that something is A, it's already changed and it's not A.
It's already changed and it is not A. Indeed, and the example they would bring, to have some, and again, this is not completely. It could make sense within a particular context. So Engels, I think, brings the example of the caterpillar and says, at any moment, what is a caterpillar? Like today, it's a caterpillar. 3 days later, it's a butterfly. Before, it's like this small thing. So they say you need to see the whole process. And the whole process is this thing going from caterpillar to butterfly. So if you don't see the whole, the process, you're missing something. Which it's not completely crazy to say. And but this has some epistemological implications, as for example the disdain of Marxists for definitions, even the things like class, for example. Marx barely defines what a class is, and when you press a Marxist, he will say, "Oh, class is something that you need a relationship. Like you can define it only by seeing it in action, by seeing it in struggle, by seeing it in conflict." Which is also why they haven't given us what do they mean by freedom?
It's so funny because Aristotle took care of all of this. In his Metaphysics, he dealt with what is change. He explained why one thing can become another and that is not a contradiction. What was the other thing you just mentioned? Anyway, Aristotle addressed it too. I forgot the thing that I was.
The development, But again, these are the waters that I'm not good at navigating because it goes above my knowledge, this deeper epistemological stuff. But let's put it this way: epistemology was not Marx's strongest point. Actually, he was not particularly interested in it, which is very weird. Mm-hmm. For example, it begs the question: how does he know he's right? He tells us that most intellectuals are impacted by their environment, to put it in today's language. They are influenced, not to say determined, by their surroundings, to put it this way. How do we know he was right? How do we know that his method is right? So he never really gets into this question, which is, to tell you the truth, every year I'm rereading Marxism, I'm less and less impressed. Actually, there was like a curve. At some point, I thought, okay, Marx is maybe bad ideas.
Maybe the Dunning-Kruger curve, yes?
Yes, I am at the level in the curve where I am every year, because every year that's some advertising for my course. Every year, I'm doing the course as if I'm doing it for the first time in terms of my research, more or less. And every year, I'm less and less impressed with Marx. Particularly when you see how many things he got from other people, even some of his slogans, like some of the famous slogans, the Communist Manifesto, you can see they were not truly theirs. But anyway, this is not to take something away from him. He was when he wanted a brilliant polemicist. He was definitely curious. Definitely, he tried to do deep work in understanding the economy. But at the end of the day, is he a heavyweight in philosophy? No. And if you ask me, he didn't want to be a heavyweight in philosophy. Marx wasn't a system builder. He was not a system builder. You can be a system builder and be a good or a bad system. Like, some people might don't like Ayn Rand, whatever. It's difficult to claim that Ayn Rand at least did not attempt to be a system builder in philosophy. With Marx, I don't think he even attempted to be a system builder. He claimed he has no morality, no moral strand in his philosophy. He doesn't pay much attention to epistemology. It's like he goes straight from metaphysics dialectics, conflict, history going forward, to politics. So
I actually realize now, because yes, you're right. I heard you mentioned earlier in the classes that epistemology does not feature heavily in Marxism. But now I think about it, it does make sense, because he's a determinist. So if you're a determinist, you don't need epistemology, because there's no way you should process data. There's only the way you do that you cannot help, right?
That's a very good point. That's a very good point. And actually, Onkar Gatte made this point also in the class, which was a revelation for me. And I forgot it till now that you reminded to me. So that's a good point. At the same time, if you go to a Marxist and tell him, unless he's like this, I don't know, old-style Althusserian, smoking Gauloise or whatever, if you tell a Marxist that Marx is a determinist, many of them get triggered. They say, "Oh no, there's this line: human makes history, blah 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 blah." But I think it's impossible to seriously engage with Marx and not say that at least there's very strong evidence of some determinism there. Which is why, at the end of the day, if you're dreaming of human brilliance, of human flourishing, conquering space, transplanetary, whatever, you cannot be a Marxist unless you are evading, unless you are closing your eyes, not wanting to see what's in front of you.
Yeah,
because
actually,
without free will and without human agency, how can humanity achieve these brilliant things?
Yes, and you reminded me then, I was going to bring up evasion earlier when you gave the example with the mud pie, right? So I said, if you dig a hole for 10 hours, then you fill it up for 10 hours, you've produced no value, yet the Marxists would say there's 20 labor hours of value in that. Now, then the counter argument is, oh no, Marxists wouldn't say there's value in that, as they wouldn't say that there's value in the mud pie. But they don't explain why, because it does logically follow from their labor theory of value that a thing has as much value as the average amount of labor hours required to produce it. So there has to be an evasion, because there's a conflict between those two positions.
Yeah, and
they
they know that.
You have to be kind of an idiot to not notice the conflict. Marxists are not necessarily idiots, as you pointed out. So they're just evading this point.
They're evading. And notice that they know that there is the term use value. This is a term that Marx was using. They understand the idea that something has value only if someone wants it. But anyway, so the big picture here is that if you seriously engage with Marxist theory and philosophy, in my view, you come out on the other side, at least with very serious questions, not to say dismissing it altogether.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. All right, let's get into the actual history of Marxism, the history and also the present. So firstly, a very general question. How did Marxism take over the world so quickly after Marx's death?
Because there is something that Marx and Marxists would dismiss, which is the role of the big, the
role of ideas.
No. Yes, but also the big men of history. I have the Greek translation in my mind. The great men of history. Sorry, the great men of history. The role of the great men in history, and such a man was Lenin. I don't think there's ever been someone. I don't know if Jesus Christ was an actual historical person, but leaving Jesus Christ behind, I don't think there's someone who in such a short time changed the course of human history so much as Lenin did. So if we find ourselves in 1917, okay, Marxism is something completely marginal. There are some Marxists in Germany. They are in disarray because of the First World War, because half the party they are participating in, the Social Democratic Party, is in favor of the war, or at least it's not committed against the war as they should be. In the rest of the world, there's not much happening. There's some people in Russia who take Marx seriously, and basically that's it. And Marx died in 83, so 17 plus 17, I'm not good in maths, you do the math, probably 32 years after Marx's death, not much is happening. But there's a world war.
Mhm.
People look around and say, wait a minute, maybe this is because of capitalism. They believe, of course, that is completely bonkers, that capitalism is why First World War happened. But anyway, I mean, just see who are the participants and see who of them are, quote, capitalists. But anyway, so they look around and they said, maybe the current system, whatever this is, has failed.
Mhm.
And there you have in Russia a small group of people. And when I say small group of people, I mean small group of people. People who no one knew them, but within this chaos, they grasp the opportunity and they come to power. And they end up keeping that power. And by keeping that power, they move Russia out of the war. And they start building a regime through violence, through conflict. And suddenly, Marxism becomes, from this marginal theory, ideology, however you want to call it, suddenly to ruling the biggest country in the world. I mean, I've never tried to think of an example. Maybe that's not a very tasteful example, but I don't know. Imagine, I don't know, like something happens in China, whatever, now, and there's like 100 objectivist people there, and suddenly in 5 years, they've taken over all China. I don't know, and China becomes like radical.
That's the level of absurdity you're talking about, because you're talking about a country that is devoted to very collectivistic, altruistic ideals.
Yeah,
and
you're right. But I'm just
proliferating in no time.
Yeah, I'm just trying to portray how unexpected and weird it would be. Now, you are right. There were tells that Russia was ready for some form of authoritarianism, some form of socialism. Even the right wing was anti-socialist in Russia. They were anti-Semite and anti-liberal, which in their mind it was the same thing, or at least big parts of the Russian right. So suddenly, Russia has a new regime, and this regime tells humanity this war, and then some years later, this crisis is this old regime that is dragging you to the abyss. And there's another way. And look what's happening here. We have the scientists, the intellectuals, the workers. We are modernity at its best. We are the spearhead of humanity. And this is how Marxism becomes relevant. Immediately, they try to export the revolution through the Communist International. And this is how, just like that, within a few years, communism becomes from a very, very marginal theory to something which takes over, at least intellectually, is eager to take over the world. And at some point, it looks like this is a fire that is spreading, and this is the future.
Well, in a way, it's good. You and I are both students of objectivism, so it's good to know that a small group of intellectually committed, fierce people can overturn a culture. However, I think in the case of those revolutions, say the Communist Revolution, you would agree that they were taking advantage of a whole undercurrent of altruistic beliefs and collectivism and so on, right? I mean, you can imagine, at least, I guess it's easier in retrospect, but you can imagine Russia going from authoritarian Tsarism to authoritarian communism. It would be much harder to imagine it going from authoritarian Tsarism to free,
100%.
Capitalistic society.
100%. Yeah. You are right. We have an uphill battle, which is completely different from the uphill battle of the Bolsheviks. But again, having said that, what the Bolsheviks, the party of Lenin, the Russian communists, what they achieved was unimaginable. We're talking about a party which had something like 1,000 core activists in a country that spreads to how many time zones? I think like 6, 7, maybe 8 more time zones.
Yeah. It's about to be.
Yeah. Here's my favorite highlight and funny story, let's say, from the Russian Revolution. Just a few months, and when I say a few months, how far is July from November? Let's say 3 months 3-4 months before Lenin becomes the ruler of Russia, the secret police sends a group of secret police officers to arrest Lenin in his house. They get in his house, they find his wife, and they find the guy who looks nothing like Lenin. He's tall and fat, Lenin is small and lean. And they arrest him because they don't even know how Lenin looks like, what Lenin looks like. Even when Lenin comes to power, he walks around, because he liked taking strolls, he walks around Moscow without any serious bodyguard team, because no one knows how they don't know who this guy is and how he looks like. The police once or twice arrests him, thinking, who is this guy who walks around the Kremlin? And at some point, some, how you call these people, pickpockets, attack him, not knowing that this guy is the ruler of Russia. And all this happens in the first few months after Lenin is in power. So this is how insignificant a power the Bolsheviks were. And yet, they were the most persistent. Okay, so let's say, what are the lessons? Is there something that we can learn from that? Lenin is the guy who promised peace, and he delivered peace. I mean, quote, peace. Next thing, he wanted the Red Army to take...
the Civil War wasn't very peaceful. But yes, peace with Germany, yes.
Peace with Germany. And he gives basically a third of Russia to Germany. So, okay, but he promises peace, he delivers peace. He promises land reform, he brings some form of land reform. Of course, within 9 years, the regime makes every farmer a feudal slave, basically. But he was persistent in a country where no one else was persistent.
Just quickly, his promise was peace, bread, land. You haven't commented on whether he delivered the bread yet.
Well, the bread, I'm not taking it that seriously, because the truth is that, we have in our mind the Tsarist regime as a completely useless regime. It wasn't that useless. So it's not that the average Russian was starving. You know when they were starving? In 1921, when Lenin put forward his radical economic policy, and there was a famine in the hands of the Bolsheviks. By the way, who saves them from that famine? The Soviet Union.
Oh wait, I know this.
The United States.
Yes, actually, that was the cause. Was that the cause of the Dust Bowl? Because they needed to clear away all. There was some. I forgot if it was corn or wheat, but the southern states donated enormous amounts of grain or some agricultural product to relieve a famine in Russia.
There was a time when the Americans were feeding millions, like double digits, more than 10 million Soviets every day. The reason the communists did not collapse early on was because of American help. Well done, Hoover, well done, Americans. Anyway, but the thing is, what Lenin promised early on, he looked like he was delivering it. And the most important thing, he took the country out of the war, whereas the idiot who was Kerensky, he was like the provisional government between the Tsar and Lenin. The people who actually did the first revolution against the Tsar, because the Bolsheviks, it wasn't really a revolution, it was more like a coup. They didn't have anyone opposing them anyway. But anyway, the guy who was in charge before Lenin, Kerensky, a social democrat, so to speak, he promised he would take Russia out of the war. And what does he do in the summer? He returns to the war, right? How stupid that was.
And there was the infamous Kerensky offensive against Germany, which failed so badly. And that actually, if I'm not wrong, it really helped the communist sentiment, because they were saying, this is a disaster, attack your officers, rather than the German.
Exactly. And, sometimes, even these days, we say, with Trump or with other politicians, like how stupid a mistake. So some people, they see a politician doing something and say, look, he can't be that stupid. Well, Kerensky proves that a politician can always be more stupid than you think. Because after the Kerensky offensive that you mean, so he's already delegitimized. There's a military person, Kornilov, and he says to Kerensky, look, let me get into Petrograd and I'm going to hang from a lamppost Trotsky and Lenin and all these people. And what does Kerensky do? He's afraid that because Kornilov has some, I don't know, charisma, leadership abilities, whatever, he's afraid that Kornilov is going to threaten his position. So he opens the storage and he hands out guns to the workers. He hands out guns to the Soviets. The Soviets were Council of Workers. And
to protect himself against the general that's coming to protect his city against them.
Against Kornilov, yes. Yeah. And also, another great idea, who is the most charismatic revolutionary at the time? Because again, Lenin was a brilliant political mind, but he wasn't charismatic orator and all that stuff, whatever you might have seen in propaganda movies. Trotsky was the real charismatic guy, and he was in prison. So what does the political authorities do? Let's release Trotsky. What could go wrong? Then Trotsky joins the Bolsheviks. The rest is history.
Have you seen the series Trotsky?
No, I get pissed off with these series. Usually they have historical inaccuracies and all that stuff. I haven't. Maybe, is it good? Is it good?
I wouldn't say, look, I watched it when I was a teenager, so my sense of taste wasn't so developed then, but I did enjoy it at the time. I don't know if, and also it's in Russian, so I can appreciate that. But you're right. It does have a lot of very sensationalized, material that is not historically accurate. But it does, I think, capture his charisma and his leadership ability. Because let's talk about Trotsky, because I think he's fascinating. He was really determined. We can certainly agree on that. And
he was determined.
He organized the whole Red Army, traveled across Russia, winning battles across the whole Civil War, and started from a position of enormous disadvantage. When he took over Petrograd in October of 1917, I think Slavoj Žižek was talking about this. He had a very clever idea. He said all of these kind of obvious protests against the government where you march on the steps of parliament and all that, they don't do anything. Well, there wasn't. I don't know if there's a parliament, but the palace or whatever. Mm-hmm. But they don't do anything. You just need to control the infrastructure. You just need to control the electricity, the post at the time, the ways in and out of the city. Once you control this, who cares who's in the palace? That's the easy part. Yeah.
Something on this, there's an interesting, most people have in their mind the Russian Revolution, the October Revolution as the storming of the Winter Palace. Mm. It's so comical that if it wasn't tragic, it would be super funny, like the stuff of comedies. There was no storming of the Winter Palace. It was just walking in the Winter Palace. The ministers were there literally waiting to be arrested. They thought it's probably easier to be arrested there than try to escape. And the people who was guarding whatever was remained of the authority in Petrograd was, get this, a battalion of women and invalids. A battalion of women, like nothing sexist here, nothing ableist here, but we realize that if your special forces that have remained at your service is the battalion of invalids and women in 1917, as a central power, something is off there. So the Bolsheviks enter the Winter Palace, and then the real struggle begins, which is not how to fight the reaction or whatever, but it is how to save garrison after garrison of the Bolsheviks for getting completely drunk, like dying from alcohol because of the cellars of the Winter Palace that had the best wine reserves in the war. So there were more Bolsheviks who were harmed by an orgy of drinking when they took the Winter Palace rather than trying to get to the Winter Palace. But you have this giant, Sergei Eisenstein, perhaps one of the best directors in the history of cinema, who has immortalized the attack on the Winter Palace, and now we have it as this heroic moment. He's also immortalized. For me, it's the best 1 minute in the history of cinema. In his film October, this is from the 10 Days That Shook the World, the book. The scene when Lenin arrives in Petrograd, in the Finland station in April. And he gives this passionate speech, and your hair crawls. again, Lenin was not a great orator, but because Eisenstein portrays him this way, now in our mind, Lenin was this great orator. To return to what you were saying. Yes, Trotsky was way more charismatic than Lenin. He also looked the part. The importance of appearance. He had these leather jackets that Ayn Rand also talks about the appeal they had in With the Living. A good orator, but he wasn't a good administrator. That's why there was no really ever a conflict between Trotsky and Stalin. It was immediately clear that Stalin prevailed. That's the one thing. The other thing, which is my hottest of all the hot takes on early Russian history, if Soviet Union had gone with Trotsky instead of going with Stalin, I think it would look more like Khmer Rouge Cambodia rather than whatever it looked with Stalin. Like if you put a gun against my head and you tell me you have to live under Trotsky or Stalin, I would say Stalin. Trotsky had way more crazy ideas than Stalin. First of all, he wanted all the labor power to be conscripted. Properly conscripted. So he wanted...
That means literally making everyone a slave.
That means literally making everyone a slave of the state. Like officially, you would work like with machine guns pointed against you. His vision was that Soviet Union would be a red Sparta. A red Sparta. Now, I love Spartan history as much as the next Greek loves Spartan history. But you realize what a red Sparta would mean. Like the whole country
would have no culture. It would just be a total dictatorship.
The whole country would be a barracks, basically. The whole country
would be really... Sorry?
Oh, no, I was saying the whole country would be like a military barracks, as you say, a total dictatorship. Which is also what it was with Stalin. But I think with Trotsky, it would be faster, and it would be more radical, and it would be more disastrous. A disaster condensed in a shorter period of time, which is what later happened in Cambodia, which is why you have this disaster in such a short space. So with Trotsky, it would have lasted, it would be a shorter history. The country would have collapsed earlier, but it would have been a more condensed horror and deaths in a shorter period of time, I think.
Yeah, I mean... Oh, there's so many ways we can go from here. So let's talk about after the end of the Civil War, gradually Lenin has some strokes. He's incapacitated for the last year or two of his life. Stalin uses this as an opportunity to gain power from a relatively innocuous looking position as the secretary, but he uses that to manipulate who gets what job and then builds a clique of loyalists around himself. Then, after Lenin's death, gradually takes over and consolidates power in the party, thanks to his administrative skills. He did kind of have the opposite skill set to, say, Trotsky, who was
exactly
always making these explosive, fiery speeches, but utterly useless in day-to-day management.
Exactly. And actually, I think Stalin was also a good public speaker because his school of public speaking was the church. Was a catechism. But by the way, here's a question for you, the aspiring philosopher, to think about it. I just thought about it. What is the role of luck? The role luck plays in history. Let me give two examples. Like in February 1917 is one of the warmest winters in the history of Russia, and supposedly, this played a role in the mobilization in Petrograd being more out there. But how about this? Lenin creates this position of the general secretary, and he puts Stalin there 5 weeks before he has his first stroke. So what if Lenin had this stroke just before he created this position, in which case Stalin would just be a commissar, I think, for nationalities or whatever he was? Or what if after Lenin creates this position for Stalin, Lenin stays in power properly, with a proper health for 5-10 more years? So you see how some really small details sometimes play a big role in history. We the students of objectivism, we want to talk about the role of ideas in history, which is all true. Marxists talk about the economic conditions. There's something there as well. But sometimes it comes up to these small things, and I wonder what is the role that these small how easy things could have been different. Like, imagine if Kornilov had marched into Petrograd and there's like a bloodbath again and he kills all the Bolsheviks. Like, how does history unfold from there? Anyway, I'm just thinking out loud here.
Yeah, it's a good question to ask. You also have to differentiate the metaphysical from the man-made in that. So you have to differentiate some factor that is completely outside of anyone's control, like how hot the winter was in 1917, from, well, you said, what if Kornilov did go into St. Petersburg? Well, then that would be man-made, so that would be different.
Sure. But, there were so many things, so many times. Like, if you read the detailed history of the Russian Revolution of early Soviet Union, so it's I don't know if you people who are into sports who watch this, like, sometimes you watch a game that you already know the result, and particularly if your team has lost, and it's like, so many things. I still can't believe this went that way. This is what happens when you see the history of the Russian Revolution. The Bolsheviks were so lucky, for a lack of a better word, lucky, so often. So yeah, that's the biggest triumph of Stalin, that he managed to keep this regime surviving. And Stalin, let's not be confused, he's a very committed communist. He's a very proper Marxist. Forget what the Trotskyists who drink copium are telling you. Stalin was a Marxist. He did the most by-the-book important thing for a Marxist, which would be to make sure that the basis of the Soviet economy would be socialist by collectivizing land. This was an absolute disaster, costing the lives of another famine of 5 million people minimum.
Yeah, let's talk about that. That was, you're referring to the Holodomor in Ukraine.
Yeah, I don't call it Holodomor because I'm a huge fan of the struggle of Ukraine, all that stuff. Having said that, quite often they use the famine as, this was directed against Ukraine. I don't agree with that. I don't think it was specifically directed against Ukraine. There were other republics that suffered. Of course, Ukraine suffered more than anyone else, but this was just because when you destroy the peasant community and the way of that of the crop production, whoever has the biggest production is gonna suffer the most. So that's nothing. That takes nothing from the criminality of the regime. But yes, I'm talking about what we understand as Holodomor. But again, it wasn't a uniquely Ukraine result. So Soviet Union till then, the farmers had some level of freedom, some level, so they had to pay a particular tax to the state, but beyond that, they could sell the crop, they could have some control on how they produce. So Stalin, as a proper Marxist, says this cannot continue. We cannot have a half capitalism, quasi-capitalism in what is like 97% of our economy. So he collectivizes the land, which means he turns the peasants into slaves, servants, however you want to call them. Slave is a term that has a lot of, gravitas. So, okay, let's not call them slaves, servants. He turns the farmers into servants, and the result is a complete collapse in the production, a complete collapse of the life in the countryside, and horror, blood, cannibalism. Just watch Mr. Jones, which is one of the few.
Yes, I was going to bring that up. I was going to bring up that film. Great film, really good.
Yeah, one of the few films that has the guts to show Soviet Union for what it was. Anyway,
and also to show America for what it was, because the New York Times. Oh, please just tell the story. What was the New York Times?
Probably you know the story better. Yeah, they had the Duranty. What was his first name? I forget at the moment. So the the guy of the New York Times in Moscow was, I won't say an asset, because this guy, I think it was so bad, Duranty, that I
Walter
don't
Duranty.
think that he was like a spy. He was doing this out of, I don't know, he thought this brings perks with the work. I'm not sure exactly why. But anyway, he's a guy who is in speaking terms with Stalin. Stalin invites him at his office. And the report he gives to the world is that, look, there is some shortages, but there is no famine. And also he gets a Pulitzer Prize for his reporting. What a shame. What a shame. Anyway, so the world doesn't know much about the famine at that time. Of course, there are these armies and armies of intellectuals who are sealing for Soviet Union, and they deny all this. I also denied it when I was a communist. I thought, well, you know, sometimes things go bad. There's a bad crop. Maybe some people died. And the funny thing is, if you talk even today to Marxist-Leninists, like to proper Orthodox communists, they say the collectivization was a success. And they are right. If you see it from a Marxist point of view, the collectivization was a success. That the economy after that was more of a proper socialist economy. The fact that there were 5 million people dead doesn't change that, because for a Marxist, that's not the point. The point is not did 5 million people live or die. The point is, but now our economy is a properly socialist economy. So Marxist credit to Stalin for what he did, and this is the only way you can make a society socialist, by the horror that we saw in the collectivization.
Yeah. All right. So if one thing we learn as, say, students of objectivism is that production requires freedom, that force and reason are opposites, and yet, I mean, we don't want to evade facts here. So it's true that under Stalin, the Soviet Union did industrialize very heavily. They did technologically advance, and eventually were building nuclear weapons and submarines and all of this. How is that possible? What's going on there?
Indeed, if you see it, let's say, from a detached point of view, you could say, oh, we have a miracle that took place here. With some caveats, though. First caveat, who is the biggest sponsor of the West, of the Soviet industrialization? The biggest sponsor is the West, in more than one ways. First of all, we have direct investments by Western companies in Soviet Union. And that's not even like a secret. It was completely open. I told you how the Soviets were very lucky. One of their biggest fortunes was that 1929 is the crisis, the biggest crisis, the crash, the depression in the West. So the Soviets says we're open for business. We're out of the business cycle, so don't worry about whatever's happening in the stock markets in the West. Come and invest here. And many Westerners do come and do go and invest there. So they import engineers. Sometimes they import factories. One of the biggest Ford factories was in Nizhny Novgorod.
Nizhny Novgorod.
Nizhny Novgorod, yes, indeed. So part of this is direct Western investment. One of the miracle towns that came out of nowhere in wilderness, Magnitogorsk, the planner of the central planner, let's say, of the town was Western architects. So when it comes to machinery, planning, and know-how, most of it is indeed imported by the West. Another great aspect, spying. There's a lot of spying, particularly in the areas of aviation. And again, how stupid the West is, right? Quite often, these Soviets scientists are openly invited. It's like, hey, you can come and see our factories. Let's exchange students. Why would you want to exchange students with Soviet Union? Half of these, almost all of these students were NKVD, secret police recruits. And now, and also, you have a country which is a huge country, which has a lot of raw resources, raw materials. So the question is, if the Soviet Union, if Russia was just going on the Tsarist, let's say, path, wouldn't it have also industrialized? And the answer is yes, it would have industrialized. When it comes to the farming sector, to agriculture, it took them decades after the collectivization to go back to where they were in 1916. So it's yes, the final result is you have a country that has modernized. Before World War II, Soviet Union has one of perhaps the biggest army in the world. How this army does in the war is another question, different reasons, but it has an impressive army in terms of size, one of the most mechanized armies. So all this is indeed, these are indeed achievements of the regime that it managed to do these things. But it didn't happen because of socialism. It happened more despite of socialism. And they brought with them blood and servitude and what would have been without socialism. Maybe Russia would be faster and better industrialized without socialism. No, actually, not perhaps. It's sure. Because what would have happened without any help from the West, without any investment of the West? They didn't have engineers, they didn't have the know-how, they didn't have the capital, they didn't have the technology. All these things they imported.
So yeah, they were parasitizing the productive capacity of the West. But what's interesting is, why did the West do this? Why would the West help their... you mentioned that they didn't really understand communism. What was the view in the West about what was happening in Russia? We've already covered the fact that many of the facts were distorted. There was a lot of outright lying, say by the New York Times.
Yeah.
But why was America so sympathetic to the Soviet Union?
I mean, that's the worst thing, right? It wasn't. So there were many Americans who were honest anti-communist. Hoover was an honest anti-communist. But because all he was like, a Christian altruist, when there's the famine in 21, they're like, oh, we cannot let children die. Let's help them. We have a duty to help them. Okay, I understand no one wants to see children starve. Totally understood. But let's see what happened in retrospect. They saved the regime, and then the regime brought millions and millions and millions of more people to starve, to die, to suffer in the gulags, to suffer in the torture chambers during the Great Purge, or later in Poland with the ethnic cleansing and so on and so forth. So well done, American altruist. You saved the regime in order to save lives. And indeed, saving lives is very important and noble. But see what happened after you saved the regime that later took more lives. So that's the one thing. That their anti-communism was, at the same time, they had this idea that we cannot let Russia starve. Later, it was more pragmatism. What does pragmatism mean? Let's go there for a quick buck. Let's invest there. What could go wrong? Like they definitely don't have strikes there. They don't have unions there. It's going to be easier to make money there. For some people it was, for many people it was not, because whenever the Soviets would change the rules like that, what are you going to do? You're going to have a war with Russia because they stole your machinery or they arrested your engineers. But also, it was particularly later with people like FDR, with Roosevelt, they didn't understand that this was a very special country, that this was a country like no other. So Roosevelt believes, I'm such a badass. I will play Stalin. I will play Stalin. If only we sit on a table with Stalin, I'll get what I want from him. Because it's just a country. But no, Soviet Union was not just a country. It was an ideology.
And Stalin wasn't just a man. He wasn't just some random guy.
He wasn't just a random guy. And again, I would say Stalin perhaps is one of the most impressive rulers in history.
Mm-hmm.
Impressive in his evil, obviously. So Stalin's evil is unlike the evil of anyone else because it's difficult to understand and to explain. Like Hitler's magnitude of evil is unspeakable, but it's easy to understand. In terms of he hated the Jews, he told us he would do horrible things to the Jews and to the Slavs. He did horrible things to the Jews and the Slavs. I mean, horrible, but we are within a universe of meaning. Many of the things Stalin did don't make sense even within evil, even within the universe of evil. But
yeah, even by the ideology of the
even by the ideology, sometimes it's difficult to make sense of Stalin. But the way he played the West is impressive. Already from the 30s till after the Second World War. The fact that he started World War II being an ally of Hitler, the fact that by 1941, Stalin had attacked exactly the same amount of countries that Hitler had attacked. Hitler had attacked 7 countries in the beginning of the war. Stalin had attacked 7 countries at the beginning of the war. Finland, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, Poland, that
Georgia.
part of Romania that today is Moldova, and he also attacks somewhere in Manchuria.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, he occupies half of Poland, and yet the West declares war to Hitler, but does not declare war to Stalin. And then when Hitler turns against Stalin, for reasons that they couldn't divide the loot, and also they knew that at some point they'd have to fight it out, but anyway, and literally the day Hitler attacks Stalin, the West turns completely and turns around and says to Stalin, now we're friends, tell us what you want, as much as you want, here's aid, here's weapons, here's in any term you want. This is impressive. What Stalin achieved is impressive. If actually I could have dinner with one person in history and I could ask them any questions I would want, I would definitely want to have dinner with Stalin to try and understand how he played the West like that is something which is unbelievable. Or maybe I should have dinner with FDR and ask him, how could you not see that you were a sucker for Stalin, that he played you like that before the war already, during the war, he played you like that in Tehran, he played you like that in Yalta, and what were you thinking?
Yeah. So that explains how a totalitarian state can become industrialized if it receives help from non-totalitarian states, from outside. Because indeed, if it didn't receive that help, totalitarianism is incompatible with wealth creation. It would just starve under its own incompetence. Like the world of Atlas Shrugged, when all the productive geniuses leave the society and the government exercises more and more control, they end up unable to stay alive because they've purged all the people who create the wealth. All right, so
let me say something on that very quickly.
Yes.
We jump a bit ahead in history, but there were 3 communist countries that were almost entirely isolated. North Korea, although it had some help from China and from
they get Chinese help. Yeah, China's help all the time now.
Albania, although it also had some early relationship with Soviet Union and then with China, and even more Cambodia, or as it was called during the communist rule, Democratic Kampuchea. It's very telling that the biggest hell on earth of communist countries were the countries that could not be bailed out by their betters, and particularly Cambodia. Cambodia didn't have any relationship with anyone, and you saw that within 3 years, they eliminated 22% of their population. This is what would have happened, both in Soviet Union and in China, if they were left to their own devices. If they were left to their own devices, we would be in an Atlas Shrugged Part 3 stuff, and quickly we would descend to an anthem territory. Talking about this topic.
Now Pol Pot, I believe, who ran the Cambodian regime, studied at the Sorbonne.
That's a bit, that's a bit overplayed. It's not, many people say, it's the thing with Cambodia is they were sure about 2 things. Number 1, that revolution means egalitarianism, and number 2, revolution means get rid of Western influences. And you see how it played out. But again, there's nothing special there. That was actually happening in Soviet Union before the West intervened to save them. It happened in 1921. And it would have happened again faster and in a bigger scale, because it's a bigger country, if it didn't have the help of the West.
So there were all these intellectuals, most of them were French, I believe, in the 60s, even earlier, who were cheering on all of these communist regimes, providing the intellectual support, which I don't know exactly the history here, but I'm sure that support had something to do with government programs from freer countries to help these dictatorships. If you have the public saying, oh, what's going on in Cambodia is a beautiful experiment in human flourishing, let's, well, not in the case of Cambodia, as you mentioned, that they were isolated. But I do believe that Pol Pot had the intellectual support of French intellectuals, particularly the postmodernists in the 60s.
Well, there's the famous story with Noam Chomsky, who says that most of the reports you hear about Cambodia are exaggerated and so on. But from the first year of existence of Soviet Union, it gets the admiration of intellectuals. And usually what happens is intellectuals travel there. They get a very special treatment. They take them to fake prisons, to fake concentration camps. They massage their ego a lot. And they give reports that their life here is even... They say things like, we cannot believe this is prison. Like, the most difficult thing is, how will people leave this prison? This prison is so good and so humane that they're going to want to stay here forever. These were literal words by people. You have big intellectuals like George Bernard Shaw, who write paeans about Stalin. Later, Sartre, particularly with Cuba, people go to Mao's China and they're excited. And the key common denominator there is, I think, these intellectuals hate so much their own societies that they're very eager to see something different. Yes. And they go there already convinced that what they're going to see is better. One example here is, I think, a guy called Stevens. I'm not sure about the name. One of the first American journalists to visit Soviet Union. And his famous line was, I've seen the future and it works. I've seen the future and it works. Now, the funny stuff is that he came up with that line when he was on a train to Soviet Union. He hadn't even entered Soviet Union, and he came up with that line. So that's quite telling that these people, it's more like they hate the responsibility, I think, of freedom. That's what these intellectuals were very uncomfortable with. That capitalism tells you it's your life, and you have a responsibility to take your own decisions, to make your own choices. That's why you'll find that most of these intellectuals get fascinated, not just by the societies, but, and here's the most crucial thing, they're fascinated by the leader. Mm-hmm. If you listen to Jean-Paul Sartre, how he talks about Fidel in Cuba, Fidel Castro, how he talks about Che Guevara, how he talks about the leaders of the Cuban Revolution, there's almost something homoerotic in it. There's almost something, an excitement which is beyond just fascination. And this makes me think, this is a guy who wants to be taken care of, existentially taken care of. Like, how weird that the guy who wrote perhaps one of the best existential texts, which actually literally was a turning point in my life when I read it, Existentialism is a Humanism, when he talks about the responsibility of freedom. This same guy is fascinated by tyrants who take care of the population and take care of your life. I find this very fascinating.
I don't know. I'm so embarrassed to be in the company of, like, to be at all associated with most intellectuals, because that's what they represent.
Quite often, I don't know. I mean,
and I think Simone de Beauvoir is really beloved these days.
Of course.
She was with, so she and Jean-Paul Sartre, I saw, there's like a photo of them in Tiananmen Square.
Yeah, I've seen the photo.
Yeah, when they were cheering on the Chinese communists.
So Simone de Beauvoir and Sartre, they've paraded every dictatorship, and they don't see much which is wrong with that. I mean, later Sartre keeps, like, Foucault is a bit braver in often attacking communist regimes. he has this weird fascination at some point with the Iranian Revolution. But anyway, that's another discussion. But I don't know if you don't want bad words, you can delete this.
No, it's fine. Go ahead. You quite often, the first though, so make it count.
No. I mean, quite often, the term I have in mind is intellectual prostitutes, but I don't find this very capturing, because it's not that if someone pays them more, they would say the different things. It's disgusting how they prostitute themselves for these dictatorships. But actually, prostituting is not the proper word, because they don't do it for the money. Most of these people would do this even for free.
Prostitution is far more honest than what these.
In some ways, it's far more honest than what these people are doing. Louis Althusser wrote a pamphlet celebrating the Cultural Revolution. Alain Badiou, which was a period of terror in China in the late 60s, with the mass meetings, shaming people. But that's not even the worst thing. Like lynchings, hundreds of lynchings every day, horrible torture. Anyway, Alain Badiou, still today a celebrated philosopher, in a book he writes in the 21st century, the Communist Hypothesis. When we know what we know about China, he still today believes that the Cultural Revolution was brilliant. And these people are celebrated in academia. And Milton Friedman, who mistakenly spends 45 minutes with Pinochet, he shouldn't have. But forever he's shamed, and forever there's this stain that, you spend 45 minutes with Pinochet and you weren't vocal enough against the dictatorship in Chile. He should be more vocal, I agree. And all these hordes of intellectuals who whitewashed all these regimes, who whitewashed the blood, the terror, the concentration camps, there's no problem about that. There's nothing to see here. So this tells you a lot about the intellectual rot in the West.
Yes. Yeah. You see the same issue. It is a very different kind of issue, but just the total misapplication of justice and moral judgment. This is just a little rant I wanted to go on. When people discuss the personal lives of intellectual figures. And I think I wanted to present something on Ayn Rand, and I was also presenting on the history of philosophy, covering Plato, Aristotle, Kant, Descartes, whatever, all of the major kind of really heavyweights in philosophy. And I think someone brought up something from Ayn Rand's personal life that, is controversial. Maybe it was her affair or something like that. And I'm just thinking, okay, so we have an essay from Karl Marx where he's denouncing Jews, on the Jewish question. So just rampant anti-Semitism. Immanuel Kant was a rampant misogynist. He had this whole theory of geniuses in which he argued that women couldn't be geniuses, some kind of metaphysical limitation on women, according to Kant. Aristotle, who was a good guy, still believed in natural slaves. These are the people you overlook. Clearly, they're not applying any rational principle. They're just ad hoc coming up with some way to dismiss Ayn Rand in this case, but really anyone they disagree with, while completely overlooking legitimately evil, really evil ideas. And in the case of these, as you say, intellectual prostitutes that travel around communist China cheering on Mao Zedong.
It's impossible to read a single article in, let's say, mainstream press about Ayn Rand which doesn't mention the affair with Brandon. Which imagine if you put the same scrutiny in the personal life of Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir. The image of Simone de Beauvoir as a feminist icon would collapse just like that. Actually, forget putting the same scrutiny. If you put 5% of the scrutiny you put into Rand's personal life, if you put this to Simone de Beauvoir's and Sartre's life, at the end of the day, I still agree that this has nothing to do with people's philosophy at the end of the day. Like you could imagine someone who has great philosophical insights and doesn't know how to leave them in their personal lives, whatever, right? So that's a different discussion. But isn't it interesting how it always comes up in Rand's life? What about in Karl Marx's life? Like, there's so many things in Marx's life which are objectionable, to put it very mildly. Yeah. Not to mention again Sartre, not to mention anyway.
Foucault was a total creep, from what I found.
I've heard things. I haven't got a good knowledge of Foucault's life. From people who are not in the left, I find many interesting things with Foucault, so I've read his work, but I don't know that much about his personal life. Foucault was slightly better than most of these people, particularly when it comes to tyrannies. But anyway, yes. So to get back to your main point, a big reason why Soviet Union enjoyed this appeal and communists enjoyed this appeal was the intellectuals. And the communists made use of it. They were telling to their own people, look, the brightest minds in the West, you are lucky that you live in these societies, because the brightest minds in the West recognize how we are the better societies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, so let's look at all right, I'm just deciding which way to go here. We will edit out this minute. Death toll. All right. Oftentimes when I talk to Marxists, which is not very often, but in the few times that I have, pretty much every time, they have felt compelled to say, we're not Stalinists. That wasn't real communism. If the joke is, if only you were the dictator, I'm sure it would be perfect. But in any case, I can see how what we've been discussing could be objected to by someone saying, yeah, that just was a misapplication of Marxism. Stalin was a tyrant. What do you have to say about that?
Yeah. First of all, it is true that the Stalinists were a tiny, people who self-identify as Stalinists are a tiny minority. This is very true. But the people who say this was not real socialism are not a minority. They need then to tell us two things. Number one, they need to tell us exactly why it was not real socialism. And related to that, they need to tell us what real socialism would look like. How would real socialism operate? And what did Soviet Union did that you would do differently? With Stalin, let us say, most of the people would not do the purges against other communists. Let's also say they wouldn't have the torture chambers, they wouldn't have the gulags. Okay. So let's say they would have a Soviet Union as it was in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s. Like more of a mainstream dictatorship, nothing, not a good place to live, but not the horrors.
We'll call it weak source socialism.
Yeah. Let weak source socialism.
Yeah.
And still, this was a regime.
Socialism for kids. Yeah.
Socialism. Yeah. A place where you wouldn't see horrors if you were flying with an invisible drone, or you could be invisible, whatever. You wouldn't see the horrors that you would see in the 30s. Okay. How would this be a good society still? Let's take out the purges, let's take out what exactly would you do? They say, we should have democracy in the workspace. Okay, what would that mean? In the factory, we would decide what we produce, but then you don't have central planning. And you cannot have socialism without central planning. Marx is clear that production needs to be planned. Otherwise, we descend slowly to a free market utopia. This factory produces whatever this factory wants, and then it trades with whichever factory it chooses to trade. You don't have capitalism because you don't have a private ownership of the means of production, but you have something like a market. So, and kind of this, by the way, it's funny, it's not funny, it's interesting that the places where they went closer to that model, Yugoslavia and up to some point Hungary, were the most quote-unquote humane socialist countries that you could live. Like if you told me, a gun against your head, you have to live to a socialist country during the Cold War, I would pick either Yugoslavia after 1950s or Hungary after the repression was after the 56 repression, let's say in the 60s and the 70s.
Mm-hmm.
So what exactly would they do different? Again, you cannot have this workplace democracy. You cannot not have central planning. You cannot have even the freedom of people like you who decided one day you have to leave and go somewhere else. If everyone decides to leave and go somewhere else, again, planning is obsolete. If my planning says that I'm going to have 200 workers in that village, and then 10 of you decide because you fell in love with someone in another village, you decide to leave, there goes my central planning. So all the elements, almost all the elements of tyranny and oppression will be there. The big excesses maybe are not going to be there. And actually, I can imagine a scenario where we put good people who, good quote, people who, are allergic to the view of the blood, and indeed you don't have the things. You would still have authoritarianism, you would still have tyranny, and you would still have, of course, economic mismanagement and economic fiasco.
Nikos, I've got a lot more to ask you about, but we are already over time, and it's up to you. If you've got time, we can take a 5-minute break and go through it. But if we're going to do that, we should take a little break because I've got more
okay,
stuff.
let's take a break and let's say, but because I don't want also to shout when people are sleeping, let's then take a break and put a hard stop 30 minutes after.
Okay. By the way, I was just playing. I'll probably edit this out, but I was thinking while we wait for the break, I'll play some Soviet music. My favorite song is called. Actually, no. My favorite one is March of Memories. Yeah, it's called that, March of Memories. Another really good one is called Song of the Soviet Far East.
Oh yeah, I think I've come across these two. My favorite is a Hungarian communist song. Also, the Greeks. There are some Greek very good communist songs, though most of them are remixes with music of traditional Russian music. Anyway, okay, let's go on.
Okay, so how did this? What are the differences between the old left idea, the traditional Marxism, and let's say kind of contemporary leftist movements?
Okay, the main thing which is similar is how much they disdain capitalism and how much they disdain their own societies, the intellectuals. Almost everything else is very much different. The old left sees itself as the best student, the best pupil of modernity, of the Enlightenment. Now, we could discuss whether this is the case or not, but that's how they view themselves and how they propose themselves. The new left criticizes the project of the Enlightenment, the project of modernity. They question the idea that we can know the world. They definitely question the idea that we should conquer nature. That's one main difference. Another difference is that the old left sees the working class as the vanguard of history. The new left sees the working class as alienated, corrupted, basically a lost cause. And the more we get to today, they see them as this racist gamon, as they call them in England. Actually, they have almost a classist disdain for the working class. The old left is based on the idea of a vanguard party, a revolutionary party. The new left, it's mostly social movements, more ad hoc, more, how to put it, not so disciplined vanguard parties. And these are some of the differences. The old left has also this ethos or this culture of, for a lack of a better term, stoic, stiff lip, how it's called, It's imagine like the worker who is in the factory and is strong. Imagine like a Soviet propaganda with a
holding
worker.
hammer and beating some steel with it.
Yes, exactly. Well, the new left, this is an image which is alien to it. They would say this is they would call it even fascist aesthetics.
Mm-hmm.
So these are some, for the new left, it's mostly, the middle class, the youth, the student, the social movements. So it's very, very much different phenomena. And for some time, the relationship between the two is very hostile, literally hostile. In Italy, for example, if you see in the 60s and the 70s, the communists and the new left are literally beating each other up. It's mostly communists who are doing the beating. But
I would have thought so. I would put my money, well, money wouldn't be allowed, but I would put my food stamps on the old left.
Yeah, so you have interesting examples. For example, in Bologna, you have the new left occupying universities. And because the mayor of Bologna is a communist, then you have the communist trade union doing the work of the police and beating up you punk hippies and you're spoiled brat, go do a day of honest work. So for a long time, for a time, there is a very much not a comfortable coexistence between these two. But then more and more, the old left is a thing of the past, and particularly with the generation change, the new left has completely prevailed, and there are only remnants of the old left in some countries like Greece, for example. But even Greece these days, it's the new left.
And now the old left probably has more in common with, say, Trump supporters, because they're
maybe
pretending to be the working class.
Yeah. Culturally, definitely. Culturally, you could say this is the case. But again, for me, if you ask me, this is great. I'm not too much afraid of the new left. The new left is uninspiring. The new left, they cannot have a common project.
Mm-hmm.
All this idea that this epistemology that says that you view the world based on the group you are part of, which is not miles away from Marxism, but with Marxism, at least it was your class. So the class had the capacity to include more people. With the new left, it's more prone to infighting. As people say, simply they're eating themselves. How it's the phrase.
Yes. Leonard Peikoff wrote about that exactly in the Dim Hypothesis. How the disintegration mode is tearing itself apart. Because, well, it's disintegrating, right? So
that's a good point. Yeah. I'm not sure, because it's been ages since I've read it, but I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Peikoff says that the old left is more like a misintegration and the new left is disintegration, or at least that's how I would understand it. And but whether we put the old left as a misintegration, I don't want to put words into Dr. Peikoff's mouth, but there's no question that the new left is a disintegration.
You're right. Actually, I think, though Peikoff I don't believe writes about the new left and the old left. I haven't read most of the book. I've only read like the really basic outline. I haven't read the historical analysis or the four fields outline. I do have a book. I mean, why would I need to read the book? I was only making a lecture on it on my YouTube channel.
Well, it's a difficult book. So don't take people in the audience. Don't take my word for it. But anyway, we can agree
that the old left worshipped something. It worshipped the god, which for them was the proletariat, and this sort of like direction of history. And they did worship something. And all their efforts were directed at achieving a specific goal, a utopia. Whereas the new left stands for, to my understanding, nothing. They just stand for nihilism and destruction. And that leads us into environmentalism. So where did environmentalism spring from? Pun not intended, but and how did it grow?
Well, it's first of all, I'll put this as a heading to this chapter. I get really pissed off with people who say that there's this meme that shows an iceberg, And on the top of the iceberg, which is above the sea, it has environmentalism, and below under the sea, it has the face of Marx. Or they say environmentalism is this kind of Marxism for the 21st century, whatever. Environmentalism is the death of Marxism. Environmentalism is, and the New Left in general, they are the concrete proof that Marxism and socialism are finished as political projects, at least as we knew them in the 20th century. Something has stayed. The disdain, the critique of capitalism is still here. The epistemological uncertainty, this has stayed, but the political project is dead. Now, with the more specific on environmentalism. Actually, its roots, if we want to nerd it out, you could say they're more on the right, the conservation movement, but it was more anthropocentric back then. So the idea was nature is out there for us to enjoy it, therefore we have to protect it, which is not a crazy proposal. I can understand this. More and more, though, and after World War II, environmentalism, or let's not put it as an ism, concern for the environment was a very pressing issue. In the 50s, you have the fog in London killing thousands of people. Some rivers are so polluted, you throw a cigarette, the river literally catches fire. These are big problems. But then environmentalism as an ideology gets fused with the message of the New Left, gets fused with the message of the counterculture, the anti-Vietnam War. So now it's not so much a concern for the environment. Now it's more a rejection of industrial society, a rejection of economic progress, of materialism. Materialism, not philosophically, it's sort of this earthism. And a rejection of the idea that human nature is there for us to conquer it. Where it gets completely crazy is in the early 70s when environmentalism gets its own philosophy. And that philosophy is the philosophy of deep ecology, which of all the philosophies that have ever existed, including Islam, including Nazism, including Marxism, including postmodernism, I don't think there's any philosophy as anti-human and destructive as deep ecology. Because it simply says that there is a, let's say, planetary egalitarianism. It means that human beings have there's like no higher moral value in a human being than any other organism, including literally like a bug or even something smaller than a bug. This is a worldview that produces claims such as that maybe HIV is welcome because it's gonna bring some balance by getting rid of some billion of people. So in how genocidal the taking this ideology to its logical conclusion is, we're talking about Khmer Rouge times a million.
But it's even, the thing is, what are they sacrificing man to? So if religion says sacrifice man to God, socialism says sacrifice man to a glorious future utopia. These are all, at least in their own theory, some exalted thing, whether it's God or this utopia. Environmentalism, and of course the term is a package deal because it includes concern for, say, private property and wanting to look after your garden with sacrificing yourself to that. It's the other way around, right? So the idea is nature must be adapted to man. And some of it should indeed be left alone by man in order to be enjoyed in the best way. But, well, I don't even know if that's true. We certainly benefit from having trees, but we could plant them in a far better way than they naturally do.
But we can disagree on that, on how exactly it would look like, but we do agree on that it's...
We agree that man is the standard. Man's life is the standard.
You put it in the best way. Man is the standard.
But what is this ideology called again?
Deep ecology.
Deep ecology.
Deep ecology, yes.
So and they want to sacrifice, use Harry Binswanger's term, they want to sacrifice man to mud.
At the end of the day, yes. But you know what is, and the groups that officially carried, let's say, the label of deep ecology were groups like Earth First or other green primitivists. But you know, or some green terrorists. But you know what's the most interesting thing? Some of the intellectual leading figures of deep ecology were parts of polite society. They were sitting on the boards of reputable environmental NGOs. So the environmental movement didn't see them as an embarrassment. They mostly saw them as, well, these are some interesting ideas. And again, it doesn't take a lot of imagination to see where this ideology would take you. And this bio-egalitarianism. Actually, there was a deep ecologist who put the following thought experiment. He said, let's say we're in the cold mountains, there's snow outside, and you have a small hut, a small cabin. And in the cabin, you have a baby and a rattlesnake. If you kick the rattlesnake out, it's going to die from the cold. Obviously, if you take the baby out, also it's going to die from the cold. If you leave them there, I mean, it's your guess what will happen. What is the proper thing to do? And if you take difficulty seriously,
a philosopher might struggle with that issue, but a normal person wouldn't be that stupid. Yeah.
But he made this question to show that the answer is very difficult. And indeed, if you don't, like if I ask you, okay, if we put in this mud, in this hut, if we put a rattlesnake and a scorpion or whatever, like it's not obvious what you do. But if it includes a human being, it is obvious what you do. But for a deep ecologist, it is not. Anyway, the average environmentalist would say, oh, I have nothing to do with that. And yet, I will claim that even the mainstream environmentalist, there is something anti-human to it. Not just in terms of where would their policy lead us, in terms of what would happen if we didn't have enough cheap, plentiful, reliable energy, as Alex Epstein put it. Mm-hmm. And for me, the way to figure out how these people actually, their vision is a vision where humanity is restrained, where humanity hasn't got the pride that it has in an industrial society. And it's what I call the plastic straw experiment. Now, if you do a research that takes, like, with ChatGPT, probably 5 seconds, you realize that the contribution that we in the West have in polluting the oceans with plastic straws is something like 0.02%. And actually, if we only take Western society, it's probably less than that, 0.0 something. And yet, if you notice how much energy the environmental movement has put into banning plastic straws, which is particularly annoying if you are in a country like Greece, where I use the plastic straws for my cold coffees. By the way, I have stock of plastic straws that's going to last me for long, so environmentalists, yeah, anyway. Now, notice, though, that if you engage them in a discussion, you ask them, why do you put so much energy on an issue that has very little, negligible, close to zero actual effect on the environment? And when you press them, their last line of defense is, at least we're doing something. At least we're doing something. Now, to me, this speaks volumes. What are you at least doing? Mm-hmm. This translates, at least we give something up. At least we sacrifice. Yes. Therefore, your vision is for human beings to give things up. Your vision is for human beings to sacrifice. Therefore, you don't care about preserving the environment for human beings. You don't even care about animals. Like I was involved in charities for saving the whales. Now, I don't know how this fits with my current view. I can't find the theory in which animals have rights, but like if you hurt an animal without any reason, I don't
that's
like
nihilistic. That's just evil. Yeah, that's
yeah.
wrong.
It's actually evil. I wish there was a way that we could do something with you. Anyway, but it's
you can boycott them. You can cut them off from.
Oh yes, of course,
of your interactions.
Yes, of course. Of course. Anyway, so at least, but with them, it's not even at that level. It's at the level of at least human beings are giving something up. And as you asked the important question earlier, for what? And that's the question, for nothing. You just want the humans to give something up to no goal, there's nothing that you want to achieve. You just want to give up. You want to give up in order to gain nothing. And this is what I find scary with environmentalism. But at the same time, it's such an uninspiring ideology that, again, I think it is reaching some limits, and it will never, I don't think it will be as appealing as communism. It will be more appealing to more people, but it will not reach the level of commitment that communism inspired in the 20th century.
I would like to agree with you, but I don't. I actually think that the fact that it's uninspiring makes sense to us. But you see, a lot of people aren't interested in being inspired. Maybe when communism was around, there were, in some aspects of society, there was a better culture, despite the fact that Marxism was being advocated. Not for that reason, but for other reasons, there was a better culture. There were remnants of the 19th century in people's minds. And I think they basically wanted to achieve values. I don't think that is necessarily the case.
That's a very interesting take.
Yeah, so I think that there's actually a very strong push to destroy values for its own sake in agriculture.
Look, there's no question that this is the case, at least when it comes to the left. And we realize that. So I was always cutting slack to most of the leftists, to me, all this collapsed after October 7, and particularly when I saw leftists siding with not just the Palestinians, but like the worst parts of the Palestinians. So yes, there is that nihilism indeed, and that nihilism can also be expressed through environmentalism. And I mean, it's too obvious to point out someone like Greta Thunberg, where her anti-humanism is translated from environmentalism to supporting like the worst movement and ideologies in the world. But will it become so powerful, and will it become an ideology in itself that will threaten the West? And that I'm not sure. The fact also that
environmentalism will environmentalism, isn't it already threatening the West?
But see how it reached a limit, and it became alienating to many people. It became alien. So many people already view this idea of like net zero. They view it almost instinctively with disdain, including people in the left. Again, because it has an idealism that can only be meaningful to people who in other ages would be the people who would go to, not even to monasteries, who would go to the desert and suffer, these Christian sects and all that stuff. So it's dangerous. It's definitely dangerous because, again, it's more easily, many people have bought into it, but it's a bit like woke. I think it peaked at some point, and now, particularly because it became part of the culture war, maybe for the wrong reasons, but many people are now, they want to keep away from that. And again, great, we talked about how individuals can make a change, how important the work of someone like Alex Epstein, who reframed this in a way that he gave us the words that we need in order to attack environmentalism, to paraphrase that great line from Atlas Shrugged.
Yes, I mean, it really should be obvious that if you care about human life, you want reliable, cheap energy. That's an absolute non-negotiable, economically speaking. It's all right. I was going to ask you about the far right, but there's so much to discuss there, and
yeah, we can have this as another discussion.
I thought maybe we should do that. Would you be keen to come back on maybe in 6 months' time to talk about the far right?
Sure, but after the summer, so that because I'll spend most. So, are you going to be in Ocon?
I will be at Ocon.
Okay, so after Ocon, my goal is my hope is that I will focus on the far right. So I will have more things to say then. But I will just say this for the record, for let's say to close, that I don't think that the biggest threat to freedom in the near future, at least, will be the left. It would be the right. And notice now, many people here that are like, Trump derangement syndrome, whatever. It's not that. This is not even a moral evaluation of who is worse. It is just an evaluation that I think the things that are now on the table and the things that most people are worried about, I think the right has more of a fertile ground in capitalizing on them. Or the biggest threat from the left will be if a charismatic, clever leftist who can smell the zeitgeist, who can smell the cultural atmosphere, will remake a kind of left-wing populism that will be something like a left-wing MAGA. But the new left, I don't think it's going to be the big danger in politics. I think they've had their time, but they self-imploded, and as they deserved, to use Trotsky's term, they're soon going to be in the dustbin of history.
Yes, the dustbin of history. Yeah, that's right. We should actually. I agree with you completely on that. I do think it will be the right that poses a far greater threat. That the dim hypothesis talks about this too, specifically the religious right, because they have not only a destructive nihilistic position. They're destructive of many things, but they have a positive position, and by positive I don't mean good or benevolent. I mean just a position that has identity, some specific thing that they're wanting to achieve. But I would be very curious to ask you about that, because when we talk about the far right, we're not talking about conservatives. They're actually very different. We're not conservatives either, but
we talk about the new right,
the new left.
Yeah, we talk about the new far right, which tries to emulate some of the things that made fascism attractive when it was attractive to many people. The idea that we're here to save you from a great decadence, we're here to save you from a crisis also of meaning. They talk about beauty, they talk about strength, they talk about meaning. These are things that are appealing, and they talk about myth. So you have this emotional reaction to it. But again, this will take us another 2 hours. So let's put this aside. But just let's. So here's something that people should take from this discussion. Notice what were the things that made the left appealing, and see how today's left does not have these things, but see how more and more the right understands these things. Idealism, a big project, a glorious future. No one in the left talks about the glorious future anymore. So that's why I think that this ending, where we talk about who's going to be the next big thing, follows up from the rest of the discussion, because the things that made communism so appealing, these days I find it more possible that the right will emulate them rather than the left.
Yes, and I'm very keen to discuss that with you. I know we've been bashing leftism for the last 2 hours, but we agree that actually it's the right that poses an even bigger threat, the religious right.
And again, that's not even a moral evaluation of who is worse. This is just a statement of what we predict will happen.
Yes, I mean, to be clear, I certainly morally evaluate both the left and right very negatively. They're huge threats to reason, to freedom, to individualism, civilization. One thing I noticed that was interesting, as you were talking about all the different types of leftist movements, from traditional Marxism, and then how that converted to the new left. Well, the only similarity between them is the things they hate, not any positive stance they take, right? So when the old Marxists realized that, you can't have a totalitarian state, a collectivized, means of production, and a glorious future. In order to get to that, in order to get to a materially prosperous future, you need free trade. Well, which one did they give up? Did they give up the materially prosperous future or the free trade? They gave up the free trade. They gave up capitalism. They gave up individualism. So it shows that from the beginning, the motivation to destroy freedom was far greater than the motivation to uphold the alleged end towards which they were acting.
That's a very good point. Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe it's not necessarily true in the very first wave of communists to take over Russia, but I think it would have been true very shortly.
And also it depends on who you're talking about. So there were many idealistic Bolsheviks who, by coincidence, they were very soon sidestepped, and there were some of whom who perished in the purges. Having said that, Trotsky was not one of them, so I'm sorry, I'm not going to shed many tears for Trotsky, but that goes back to what we were saying earlier.
Wasn't he assassinated with an ice pick?
And he was assassinated. He died at the anniversary that my birthday is Trotsky's demise. I'll just say one thing about Trotsky, one last thing, which is at least he had a better vision of progress than the average leftist even back then. At one point, I think
his vision was a prison, a giant prison.
Oh, no, yeah, but what would come after that? So when he's exiled and when he realized he can't have a say, he kind of reinvents himself as, again, this Promethean figure. So, and I'll end with this. In 90, I think it's in one of the last things he ever wrote. He writes something like, if within 5 years the average Soviet citizen hasn't got a private car, then socialism has failed. This is the equivalent of saying today, if in 5 years everyone hasn't got a private helicopter, we have failed as a country. Like, imagine telling this today to a leftist; they would lose their mind.
It's very good, very good. All right, to wrap up, what's your favorite communist joke?
Oh man, the favorite communist joke. Well, okay, I'll give the obvious one. It's Brezhnev chats with a lady, and Brezhnev asks her if you had one wish, what would that wish be? And the lady says, open the borders. And Brezhnev is, so you want us to be alone, right? Anyway, that's my favorite. It's not that I have so many, but you caught me. You put me on the spot. I don't remember that many right now.
Yeah, I was just thinking I was searching my library of communist jokes too. All right, I've got one. A boy in the Soviet Union is reading the newspapers and he's all inspired by all these heroic heroes of the Soviet Union. It was the highest military honor you could get, was hero of the Soviet Union. So he's walking in the forest one day and he sees a magical fairy, and she says, I'll grant you one wish, whatever you want. And he says, I want to be a hero of the Soviet Union. And suddenly he's on the battlefield facing 5 German tanks holding 2 grenades. Anyway, it's just, the idea is that you could only get it posthumously, of course.
That's true. That's true. I thought you would ask me who's my favorite Soviet. Okay, so we've said favorite Soviet song, favorite Soviet joke. We need to do a third one. Everything needs to be in threes. Okay, how about favorite Soviet leader? Okay, I will. What's your favorite Soviet leader? Or favorite, like least bad.
Oh wait, so we're not talking about most interesting or something. We're talking about like the.
Okay,
well, then probably Yeltsin. I mean, Yeltsin's already after the Soviet Union. So.
Yeah, you can't pick Gorbachev. That's too obvious.
Yeah. Okay, Lenin as a just for all he quote achieved, big quotes around achieved, but as the most intellectual of the leaders, certainly. What about you?
Most interesting, I would put Stalin, but my quote-unquote favorite, like the one who I think is the least horrible, I would definitely put Brezhnev for one reason. Brezhnev was the only one, including Andropov, who, when you read about him, you feel like he doesn't really want to be there. and he's trying to make things. It's like he's a guy who has a psychological breakdown when he has to send the troops to Prague. Basically destroys his health in the crisis of '68. He's a guy who gets into tears when there's this when he's under fire in the Politburo. But also this shows something, and that's why I kind of put that question to myself, because I want to make a point. You know, when people are saying, "Oh, if only I was in charge, things would have gone better." No, a system like that, a system which is bad in theory, a system which is like immoral and a bad idea, cannot work even if you put someone in charge who is not a bad person. Like, from what we know, Brezhnev was not a sociopath. He didn't like blood. He didn't like when he had to do things. And guess what? He did horrible things. He did send the tanks. He did persecute dissidents. So it's not about, oh, if only we had better people or whatever. It's a system which is bad in theory, and therefore it was bad in practice. Evil in theory, destructive in practice.
Okay, just one more thing. You just reminded me. I've been recently rewatching a show called Man in the High Castle.
Oh, of course, yes.
Yeah, have you seen it?
Yeah, I've seen it, yeah.
Well, I am really interested in the character of John Smith. So the
premise who carried the whole series.
Yeah, he did. You're right, he did carry the whole series. Is absolutely fascinating character. So Man in the High Castle is an alternative reality where the Nazis win World War II and they divide the world between them and the Japanese. And it's about a character called, one of the main characters is John Smith, who is this high-ranking, originally American, but now Nazi official, who started off in the American army and eventually changed sides, and now has risen up the ranks. And he tells himself it's all to kind of protect his family, but he just keeps committing more and more evil. And it's a really interesting study in kind of, he's a very well-written character and really brilliantly played by the actor. So
Obergruppenführer Smith, yes.
John Smith, yeah.
Yes,
it's really brilliant that they named him John Smith, the most typical American name.
Yeah. It's a bit like Breaking Bad. Like, you see how, again, bad ideas cannot lead to good outcomes. Let's leave people with that.
Mm-hmm. All right. On that, Nikos, thank you very much. We've gone way over time, but certainly enjoyed our conversation. It's been an unusual podcast. I think I'll edit it very minimally. I'm just going to edit out the break in the middle and the start and the end. Actually, just the start, and then
just the start. Yeah.
Good.
Thank you very much, Nikos. And thanks anyone who's watched till now. Thanks for your time. It's appreciated.
Anyone who's watched till now gets our congratulations for making it through. All right. Thank you. I'm just okay.